Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Megan Doherty, the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather today, we are all on Indigenous lands. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indokina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples. We are grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we've put some links in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée des Abenaki in Odenak, Quebec. I'm delighted today to have Maria Farland with us. She's taught at Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and Wesleyan universities, and is currently associate professor at Fordham University in New York. And this lecture is drawn from Professor Farland's forthcoming book, Degraded Heartland, Anti-Pastoral Agricultural Reform and the Rural Modern in U.S. Literature, 1840 to 1950, forthcoming with Johns Hopkins University Press. It's a history of ideas of rural backwardness and inferiority in terms of the anti-pastoral mode. Please join me in welcoming Professor Farland.
Okay, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm just amazed at this audience. Nothing like this ever happens in New York City, where everyone just stays in their apartments. So that's just marvelous. And I'm thrilled to be in Plymouth. The project that Megan was describing is something that I began more than 10 years ago. And in a sense, it began at Plymouth in a bizarre way. I became really obsessed with Robert Frost, the academic year that he spent here and why he was here. Initially, I was interested in the history of education, which was a subject he was hired to teach, and psychology. And then eventually I became really interested in this rural backwardness discourse that I'll be talking about today, which 10 years ago when I started the project, people would sort of scratch their heads and say, why are you interested in ideas of rural inferiority? But nobody asked me that question today. From 1899 to 1911, the poet Robert Frost lived and worked as a farmer in Derry, New Hampshire. He was involved in commercial poultry breeding and also taught English at Pinkerton Academy in Derry. He struggled mightily to publish his poems in the US. In 1911, the year after he spent a year teaching at Plymouth Normal School, now Plymouth State University, he sold everything and moved his family to England. He brought with him from Derry nearly all of the poems for his first two books, A Boy's Will and North of Boston, published in 1913 and 14. With the help of the poet Ezra Pound, who lived in England at the time, he published them with David Nutt Publisher in London, and they were almost immediately published in New York, where they caused a sensation. This is Frost's home. This is Frost's home in Derry, and this is Rounds Hall, familiar to all of you, I'm sure, at Plymouth State, where Frost taught during his year at Plymouth State, and the house he lived on at the right, which I believe is still there, but it's not on the same street axis. And here's Frost a year later in London, celebrated in literary culture. So for me, this is a sort of very dramatic story of a person who risked everything, and it paid off for him. But it was by no means entirely probable. And what I'll talk about today is some of what he was doing right before he did this and made this move. The most famous poem of North of Boston, Mending Wall, centers on a confrontation between the poet and a farmer beyond the hill, a description that marks its specific place in the remote hill towns of New England. Quote, good fences make good neighbors, the farmer says in his famous line, his sole utterance in the poem, punctuating it with emphatic assertions of his individuality. The farmer's radical independence has been understood by critics to signal Frost's concern with self-reliance in his idealization of the independence of rural people and places. And certainly these critical accounts capture a crucial feature of Frost's poetry. But the poem also bears the marks of a conflict that I'll be arguing today was central to the book Frost tentatively titled Fairy Tales of Farming. In the farmer's resemblance to what the poem calls an old stone savage, and that's in the right column, I've bolded it, we see echoes of writings in these years like Henry Osborne's Men of the Old Stone Age, a 1915 book that Frost had read carefully. In Osborne's book, rural individuals, or types, the term he used, are seen as pagan, heathen, and inferior. Similarly, Mending Wall tells us that the neighbor farmer moves in darkness, a depiction that mirrors the era's widespread belief that there was something savage or primitive, a term used widely at that time, in what were then termed rural habits of mind. At such moments, we see Frost's direct engagement with the era's popular ideas of rural backwardness and inferiority. And these ideas are the subject of the book that Megan was mentioning that I have coming out, which looks at the long history of ideas of rural backwardness, or what Karl Marx was said to have called rural idiocy. It's a critical commonplace that modernist literature was shaped in part by the changing relationship between the city and the country, but notably absent from these accounts is the enormous preoccupation with rural backwardness, the perception of the deficiency and underdeveloped capacity that many believe characterized everything from rural schools to rural entertainment. A vast and disturbing scientific literature concerning what contemporaries termed rural degeneracy originated in part in a series of highly visible rural eugenics studies. Henry Goddard's The Kallikak Family, Arthur Estabrook's The Narm Family, and Charles Davenport's The Hill Folk, all published in 1912, essentially at the same time as North of Boston. These reports traced a lineage to Richard Dugdale's famous study, The Jukes, which chronicled a rural New York family it described as filled with, quote, paupers, criminals, harlots, epileptics, and mental defectives. A follow-up study, The Jukes in 1915, which is seen in the right-hand part of this slide, claimed that recent generations were still, I quote from the study, feeble-minded, ineducable, slovenly, and inefficient. Broadly, as many of you probably know, eugenics was a movement that originated in the 1880s and reached its peak in the teens and 20s. Eugenicists believed that they could improve the human race by sterilizing or institutionalizing individuals they saw as inferior, primarily the mentally ill, physically disabled, non-white races, but especially, and importantly for my purposes, rural individuals. Most early eugenic studies were focused on the supposed inferiority of rural populations. Eugenic studies were largely rural studies. For me, the most shocking culmination of these ideas is the Vermont Eugenics Survey, an initiative that aimed to sterilize what researchers called, quote, low-grade Vermonters, rural Americans seen not as exemplary, but defective and inferior. One rural sociologist summarized these views, quote, the words civil, urbane, and politic indicate that good manners and diplomacy are promoted by city life. In contrast, the terms rustic, pagan, and heathen connote the certain backwardness among country folk. And that's the top quote on this slide. So Frost's description of the rural savage in Mending Wall thus mirrors what I'm claiming was a prevalent cultural fascination with supposed rural backwardness. Though we have long equated the development of a uniquely American culture with rural values, the idea that rural America is America's heartland, this competing tradition of denigrating rural America merits further critical attention and exploration, especially today. The material I'll be presenting today aims to contribute to our understanding of the ongoing significance of these ideas of rural backwardness through a brief examination of North of Boston, a landmark text of modernism that includes many of the most celebrated poems in American literature, Mending Wall, The Death of the Hired Man, Home Burial, to name only a few of the most famous. Incredibly, Frost wrote all of these poems in Derry, but despite the fact that poems of rural life were quite popular at the time, he struggled mightily to publish them. And actually, it's a bit of a mystery why. We could talk about that in the question period. As I mentioned, he sold his New Hampshire farm, he gambled it all. The book was an instant success, so this kind of struggle around that is hidden. But I think in light of these ideas of rural backwardness, it's even more remarkable. In the decades that Frost wrote North of Boston, the claim that rural places were rearguard found its counterpart in the idea that habits of mind found in cities were more forward-looking and avant-garde. And just a couple more of these little quotes. Quote, the cities attract the most active brains, wrote sociologist Howard Woolston in 1911. They form a modern aristocracy, scornful of the urban rural population. In place of the noble and idyllic qualities long associated with rurality and farming, especially in literary culture, books with titles like Rural and Urban proposed an entirely new image of the American farmer as falling prey to what one author termed, quote, progressive degeneracy. That's the last quote on the slide. No, sorry, this is the last quote on the slide. When a city dweller wishes to accuse a fellow of a lack of smartness or intelligence, he's quite likely to call him a farmer, reported the farmer in Fireside in 1920, advising readers that words like villain, yokel, pagan, and heathen were familiar epithets for the farmer's inferiority. Some commentators went so far as to claim that city dwellers were an entirely different race, biologically speaking. If rural communities needed uplift or improvement in this view, it was in part because they were seen as lesser populations. In response to these ideas, new disciplines like rural sociology and agricultural science urged rural reform through scientific training and agricultural education. The land-grant colleges became the particular site of these efforts. In New Hampshire, that was the College of Agriculture and the Mechanic Arts, founded in 1866 in Hanover and later moved to Durham. Culver Hall, pictured here, was a key building for the College of Agriculture. Epitomized in the work of the Country Life Movement and the Rural Life Commission in the early 1900s, these rural and agricultural improvement efforts attempted to reshape the countryside seen in north of Boston. Foremost among their goals was the imperative that, quote, farming requires brains of a high order, in the words of one reformer. Aided by training and expertise of the kind that was offered in land-grant colleges, modern farming would be, quote, a matter of fertile brain rather than fertile field, as the college president at the Massachusetts Agricultural College summarized, describing this new attention to technical and scientific expertise. So the rural backwardness hypothesis had enormous implications for American literature, broadly speaking, and for the vast urban-rural divide that has emerged in our own time. It hangs in the backdrop of famous texts like Edith Wharton's novel, Ethan Frome, the depressed scenes of Hamlin Garland's Midwestern fiction, the deprived villagers of Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and the decaying coastal towns of the poetry of Edwin Arlington Robinson. The obsession with rural decline seen in the era's popular and academic culture made a profound influence on literary expression and also on literary institutions. It spawned new and highly influential publication venues, including the Country Life Press, the popular Country Life magazine, the Country Life Association, and even the Pulitzer Prize, which initially was primarily awarded to rural fiction. In the arena of politics, Theodore Roosevelt's Commission on Country Life aimed at what reformer Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was then president of the New York Land-Grant College, called, quote, the desire to make rural civilization as effective as other civilizations. Policies like the Smith-Lever Act shared Bailey's sense that rural civilization lacked civility and refinement, and that progress would require new disciplines like rural sociology, again located primarily in the land-grant and agricultural college. These efforts to transform rural life also dramatically transformed the literary mode associated with rural settings, the pastoral. And over time in my work, I've gravitated towards the concept of anti-pastoral rather than pastoral as an analytic term for understanding this major set of shifts in US culture. In contrast to the pastoral, which the critic Larry Buell defines as all literature that celebrates nature and rurality, anti-pastoral emphasizes rural pain, suffering, poverty, and environmental destruction. It highlights the devastation of the land by extractive and intensive agriculture and the threats to rural community and people caused by capitalism's accelerated demand for productivity and efficiency. It evokes what the critic Raymond Williams has called the life of pain for those in the countryside. In the place of the myth of the garden, which in the words of critic Perry Miller, identified Americans with nature and its heartland with the flourishing family farm, anti-pastoral often evokes a rural landscape in a state of disintegration, declension, destruction. The farmer and the frontiersman, no longer seen as representative Americans, begin to appear as the remnants of a retrograded past. And in this way, the movements for agricultural improvement and reform are at the heart of anti-pastoral. But importantly, and this will be key in what I'll present on Frost's actual poems, modernists like Frost did not merely passively absorb ideas of rural backwardness and inferiority. His poetry deliberately responds to and refutes the idea that rural people and places were in need of improvement and reform. Frost's poems are best understood in terms of a tension between acknowledging the realities of rural problems on the one hand, and pushing back on reform-based solutions, on the other hand, especially those offered by agricultural improvement. At the same time, his poems often point to what scholars Mark Story, Ben Child, and Chris Brumell have termed the rural modern, the fact that rural places were catalysts for mechanization and modernization. In reality, Frost's work suggests, rural spaces were not behind at all. They were leading edge. Modernity's Crystal Palace and Centennial Exhibition were filled with evidence of a new rural machine age. And in fact, when we study modernism, we talk about the machine age. But if you think about the rural machine age, it starts around 1830 or 1840, almost a century before the urban machine age. Places like Derry, New Hampshire were the protagonists of this machine age and the rise of proto-agribusiness on small farms. They were the cutting edge of capitalism. Paradoxically, they embodied the modern, as north of Boston everywhere suggests. I started with the poem Mending Wall and its depiction of the farmer as an old stone savage. In that poem, we see Frost's effort to respond to the simplistic depictions of farmers as suspicious, superstitious, stupid, isolated, and to respond to traditional pastoral idols that featured simple rustic people in rural paradise. Critical studies of Frost comment invariably on the poet's relationship to the land and the landscape. In these readings, Frost's poems celebrate an ideal farmer in the pastoral tradition, tracing their lineage to Homer and Virgil. While such accounts are compelling to some degree, they neglect a vital anti-pastoral element in Frost's poetry, especially the emergence of modernized agriculture predicated on industrial and scientific elements. Frost was highly aware of the rise of scientific agriculture, and he was personally involved in it in several ways. Though many readers recall his later writer-in-residence positions, and indeed Frost is said to have invented the writer-in-residence position, how brilliant, his early years consisted of unrelenting teaching at Derry's Pinkerton Academy. He taught something like 6 classes per day. Combined with technical writing in the farm press, he was also engaged in professional poultry breeding. These were occupational roles that brought him into direct contact with rural reform and scientific agriculture. While his teaching at Pinkerton has often been viewed as the precursor of his later teaching at Amherst College, Michigan, and Harvard, Pinkerton differed markedly from these institutions, most notably in its formal commitment to agricultural education. And these are some slides from the archives of Pinkerton. This slide shows a typical class in farming. This is specifically about soil preparation and soil chemistry. And this second slide shows, actually, there's a teacher by the barrel. I believe this is from a state New Hampshire educational report from these years. And I actually believe the teacher near the barrel is Frost, although I can't really prove it because it's not very sharp resolution. The push for scientific agriculture propelled the rise of what was termed the farm press as well, the enormously varied publication venues that aim to link rural life to modern expertise. After struggling mightily to publish his poems, Frost began to contribute to farm press venues like the Eastern Poultryman. The poultry trade press furnished rural readers with technical information on improved farming, for example, the proper feeding, housing, and breeding of chickens. It aimed to transform farming from an amateur endeavor into a specialized profession linked to emergent agribusiness, about which I'll say more in a moment. Frost's early publications appeared in the poultry trade press, where he published a dozen sketches in the 1900 to 1910 decades, the very years where he was unable to publish his poems. His poultry sketches were rooted in his direct experience of so-called poultry fancy, the keeping of birds for exhibition and breeding. In 1900, Frost was reported to have brought to Derry nearly 300 Wyandotte chickens, from which he sold eggs, broilers, and cockerels, quote, for resale to other farmers interested in systematic breeding. That was reported in the Derry newspaper. Frost commenced building hen houses, and he contracted with the poultry wholesaler Charlemagne Bricot, seen in this advertisement on the left from the Cyphers Incubators catalog, quote, to deliver enough eggs to fill 2 large incubators. This type of industrial machinery was at the heart of an expanding technical literature that called on small farmers to modernize their methods and equipment. Firms like Cyphers Incubators, where Frost purchased his incubators, which probably would have looked about like this one on the left, supplied equipment, feed, and expertise to small farmers. Their catalogs offered a dizzying array of products, including poultry nets, dry food hoppers, trap nests, bone cutters. There's pages and pages of what they're offering. They also issued technical reports with titles like Poultry Plant Construction and the 200 per year hen. Though farmers like Frost did not themselves run factory farms, obviously, in effect, they formed the market for enormous agribusiness corporations like Cypher's Incubator, which is a lot of Cypher's, which was located in Buffalo, is featured in this promotional shot on the right. And Bradley Fertilizer, a mammoth company in Boston known as the Fertilizer Trust. The economics of backyard poultry are complicated. For us today, local chickens evoke warm nostalgia for subsistence farming, yet the keeping of backyard poultry also featured industrial scale elements. Typifying these trends, the 1912 Cypher's Incubator catalog describes small poultry farms as, quote, chicken factories, and the birds as, quote, hatching machines. And this is the company that Frost was ordering from. Incubators promised to replace the wild and unmanageable hen with more efficient machine incubation. Reflecting this emphasis, Frost began to appear at poultry shows. He served as the director of the Dairy Poultry Association, and he continued his work as a commercial breeder. The town of Derry would later host the New Hampshire egg auction, further evidence of its role in the wholesale egg trade. More than mere hobby farming, these activities mark the poet's personal involvement with the science-based agriculture that hangs in the backdrop of many of his poems. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to discuss Frost's poultry sketches in detail. He published them in the Farm Poultry and the Eastern Poultryman. And this is a cover story he wrote for the Farm Poultry, a Boston poultry newspaper, called The Question of a Feather. It's really hilarious. It's about these two old ladies who outsmart the experts. In these sketches, Frost gently attacks the industry and corporations that brought new expertise and farm machinery to the countryside. He often endorses the common sense knowledge of regular farmers over that of experts, or what was then called book farming. It was a question that preoccupied him. For example, in his 1890s diary notebook, he asked himself, quote, "If the new farming proves to be too much of a scientific thing for me to learn, will there be no life for me to live?" At such poignant moments, we see the poet's profound skepticism towards scientific and industrial agriculture, even as he was wholly immersed in it as a consumer, a producer, and an expert himself, in effect, in the sketches. In this spirit, in his poems, Frost frequently celebrates individual farmers who outsmart the experts, and by extension, the new agricultural order based in efficiency and training. In his poultry sketches, as in his poems, presumptions and stereotypes of rural backwardness are often directly challenged in striking departures from the era's ideas of rural inferiority. The clash between the rural rube and the urban sophisticate is at the heart of many of Frost's poems, including the very famous poem, The Death of a Hired Man. Though the figure of the hired man is familiar to most readers through Frost's poems, the problem of hired labor figured widely in the period's literature on rural problems. Emblematic of New England's decline, critics believed, was a diminishing number of farm laborers for hire. Emptied of workmen by the rush to the frontier and the city, New England towns were bereft of a stable workforce, causing many problems for the rural economy. Abandoned farms arose as much from labor shortages as rural poverty or depleted and barren soil. An entire literature emerged in these years about abandoned farms, including a best-selling report that included a detailed inventory of hundreds of empty farms in the New England region. Frost's poem, The Death of the Hired Man, thus makes reference both to the death of the actual hired man, Silas, in the poem, and to the passing of what one commentator called the lonely migratory working men who possessed little education and formal training. Nonetheless, Frost's poem suggests that these hired men possess highly valuable skills and skills that cannot be learned through formal training or education. While critical accounts of the death of the hired men have focused on the contrast between the poem's husband and wife, Warren and Mary, the poem also contrasts two kinds of workers, the college-educated boy, Harold Wilson, and the hired man, Silas. Harold leaves the farm to attend college in the city. With his college boy's assurance, he brags that he studied Latin because he liked it. I think that's on the right column of the slide. Silas vows, quote, to teach him how to build a load of hay. Silas hates to see Harold the fool of books, he says, and he believes Harold is, quote, daft on education. But Silas's working days are done, as Mary notes in the poem. Silas is worn out and unable to clear the field, a task that has traditionally fallen to him. And we see some of that in the left column of this slide. In the poem, anti-pastoral descriptors like miserable and frightening clearly indicate Silas's poverty and evoke rural suffering. Nevertheless, Silas's most impressive accomplishment, stacking hay, inspires genuine admiration in the poem. And that's in the left column of the slide. Quote, he bundles every forkful in its place and tags and numbers it, the hay, so he can find and easily dislodge it in the unloading. Silas does that well. The poem speaker further observes, quote, you never see him standing on the hay he's trying to lift, straining to lift himself. Silas has mastered the difficult art of hay stacking, to which the poem ascribes high economic worth. He can also find water with a hazel prong, and he has skills in irrigation. And the agricultural periodicals of this time indicate that this was a highly remunerative capital improvement for most farms in the region. Even in a changing economy then, Silas's skills are crucial to the farm's success, as Warren's deep frustration at his disappearance indicates. Successful haymaking determined the number of livestock a farm could support, and by extension, its dairy and meat production. Hay was seen as a proxy for the farm's overall profits and wealth. In Hired Man, hay is carefully put up loose instead of in bales, and as recounted in the poem, the driver and the laborer, Harold and Silas, worked together as a team, packing down the hay and enlarging the stack. Now, these stacks could reach more than a ton of weight. They were enormous and highly valuable. In the poem, these skills are vital to the farm's success, and they rightly bolster Silas's sense of pride in his work. At the same time, the speaker's playful comment in the left column that he never sees Silas, quote, straining to lift himself, humorously inverts rural reform's signature tagline of rural uplift. And this use of humor signals North of Boston's broader satire of rural improvers and agricultural improvement efforts. In the poem, Silas's expertise is valued, and not merely because Warren and Mary live in the hill towns that Frost views in his plans for the book. At the time, haymaking machinery was sufficiently expensive that most experts advised that most small farms should not purchase it. Farming had not yet banished the hand scythe and the mower. Hay stacking and traditional skills remained crucial to agricultural profits, even on the cusp of mechanization. Silas's labor and skills are thus vitally important, and North of Boston insists on their value. Far from the lifeless or backward brute seen in rural reform writing and writing about rural backwardness, rural people and places in the poem reverberate with creativity and a sense of craft honed over many decades. It's in this spirit that the products of farm labor are strongly aestheticized and valued across North of Boston. In its iconic orchids, decorative
1871,
carefully crafted haystacks, and specially cultivated blueberry fields. A slide like this one shows that haystacks were seen as having both commercial and cultural value and beauty. In these scenes, rural products were elevated to the status of artistic creation, what the Department of Agriculture called the rural arts, and the rural mind undergoes corresponding revaluation. So the stacks in The Death of a Hired Man are valuable not merely as commodities, but as emblems of human and social capital derived from distinctive ways of knowing, expertise, knowledge, and craft. Frost's emphasis on the creativity of rural people also structures the poem 100 Callers. It's a poem in which Dr. Magoon, I love the name, it was actually a person Frost knew in Derry, a great scholar and professor, returns to his rural hometown in Vermont. Stranded in a small hotel, Magoon is forced to share the last remaining room with a newspaper salesman named Leif, short for Lafayette. Echoing the idea of the rural savage seen in Mending Wall, Dr. Magoon says that his rural counterpart is a brute, employing classic stereotypes of rural ignorance and criminality that would have been familiar to all readers. I think the brute is on the left in the second line. Afraid of being robbed or murdered, Dr. Magoon presumes that Leif is a thief or criminal. And conversely, Rafe calls Dr. Magoon Professor Square, mocking the stereotype of urban education. But the poem 100 Callers tells a much more nuanced story. Far from a brute, Leif's discerning mind repeatedly outwits that of his educated counterpart. A subscription manager for the rural newspaper, the Weekly News, Leif possesses knowledge so formidable that he shapes the paper's policy. Farm journals had tremendous influence on the thinking of country people, as one writer of the period wrote, and they were also instruments for rural and agricultural improvement. In 100 Callers, rural individuals possess their own forms of knowledge and sophistication. For example, Leif refuses the editor's order to promote the election of William Taft. Interestingly, he identifies himself as a Vermont Democrat at a time when William Jennings Bryan had made the Democratic Party synonymous with agrarian populism. So this is a poem that's quietly aligned with populism's coalition of poor Northern farmers, white Southerners, and factory workers. While some bystanders presume that he is a brute, the poem highlights Leif's courtesy and refinement on the right-hand part of the slide. Leif exhibits surprising acts of kindness, as when he offers to send his outgrown collars to Dr. Magoon. Quote, "More than 100 collars, size 14. Too bad to waste them all. You ought to have them. They're yours and welcome." In response to Leif's very strong offer to give him 100 collars, Dr. Magoon catches his throat, recalling his earlier fears of Leif's strange appearance. To give you a sense of what it means to own 100 collars and potentially give them away, here's a store display of collars from the period. This display contains 18 collars, so picture 82 more collars, an enormous over-the-top number, which really gives us a sense of what's happening in the poem. The term white collar, familiar to us today, was beginning to be synonymous in these years with office work and higher education. So the collars link Leif to both of these worlds. 100 Collars ends on a comic note with the talkative Leif observing of Dr. Magoon, quote, "There's nothing I'm afraid of like scared people." Here, the poem playfully refutes the standard belief that rural individuals were, in the words of one reformer, despicable or ignorant or criminal. In 100 Collars, it's urban figures like Dr. Magoon who are simplistic and limited in their views, inverting the precepts of rural backwardness discourse. Broadly speaking, as I've suggested, the poem's 100 Collars are emblems of the white collar setting to which Magoon belongs, and Leif is ostensibly marginal. But in 100 Collars, it's Leif who has the superior mental abilities, and it's Leif who bestows the 100 collars in a comic inversion of the expected hierarchy. While the stereotyped idea of the rural as backward and inferior had emerged with a new force in these decades, there was a strong counter-discourse asserting the value of rural culture. Quote, "The rural mind is more original, more versatile, more accurate, more philosophical, more practical, more persevering than the urban mind. It is a larger, freer mind," wrote the critic M.T. Scudder in the 1920s. In Frost's Country People, we find the poetic representation of this rural mental astuteness in its highly varied forms, and the verbal expression to match it. Frost's rural figures offer themselves as a speaking embodiment of a society in the countryside that's neither degraded nor deficient nor backward, but alive with cultivation and culture as in nature. The two poems I've mentioned directly challenge rural improvement discourse, especially ideas of rural backwardness. And while Frost's poems celebrate practices that we think of as traditional, they are not in fact anti-modern or rooted in the past, to adapt from theorist Svetlana Boym's formulation concerning what she calls the off-modern. Instead, the poem attempts what she calls a reconstruction of a lost rural world, but in so doing, it gestures forward to a new modern order that inventively reworks the past and its practices. The 1915 postcard on this slide, titled "Derry in the Future," shows us how a place like Derry could be associated both with nostalgia for an agrarian past, a rural glory, and the modernist reinvention of that past in creative and innovative ways. And I think it also shows us how much representations of the modern were being bound up in representations of the rural. Throughout north of Boston, rural individuals are the creators of unique forms of economic and cultural capital. And that capital is seen as futuristic, even in an image like this. The final poem I'll discuss is The Housekeeper, which was drawn from Frost's keeping of chickens. In The Housekeeper, a neighbor hears the story of Estelle and John, an unmarried couple living in, quote, rundown squalor, as told by Estelle's mother, who has remained in their house even after her daughter leaves to marry another man. It's sort of a complicated backstory. Like other poems in north of Boston, The Housekeeper is deeply anti-pastoral in its emphasis on poverty, disability, and in the parlance of the day, sexual immorality. And in eugenics discourse, sexual immorality was considered evidence of rural inferiority. For Frost readers, the fact that the poem contains an unmarried couple would have signaled the kind of social breakdown in the countryside. In The Housekeeper, Estelle's mother works from home, stitching decorative beads onto dancing shoes sold in the city. In economic terms, she's engaged in what's called piecework, a pre-capitalist type of domestic production that persists even in the modern economy. Her labor straddles older modes of domestic production and the urban market for high-end commodities. Stuck in her daughter's farmhouse, she can only dream of everyone whose shoes she primped to dance in, she says. The poem's arresting image of these beaded dance shoes, the wealth of the city and leisure, stands in contrast to the impoverished woman's immobility in the farmhouse in the poem. The poem, though, links her beautiful handwork to the city and its glittering commodities on the one hand, but also to the farm's other beautiful objects, its exquisite poultry. And indeed, in the poem, profits from these decorative shoes pay for the decorative poultry, which I'll describe in a minute. Surprisingly, the derelict farm in this poem contains poultry of priceless value. Quote, "John's a bad farmer," she says. "A friend or two as good as own the farm, such as it isn't worth the mortgage," though actually it's more complicated than that. Superficially, the farm exemplifies the rural poverty that permeates north of Boston's remote farms, boarding houses, and factories. And that's not all, Estelle's mother continues. Estelle's husband, John, is helpless, untidy, ridiculous, a dreadful fool, she summarizes, and he's also a terrible farmer. But if The Housekeeper embraces tropes of rural inferiority, it also offers extravagant images of rural artistry and skill. John and Estelle aim to have their hens be the best there are, and this is on the right-hand column. Quote, "We fence our flowers in and the hens range. Nothing's too good for them. We say it pays. John likes to tell the offers he has had, 20 for this cock, 25 for that. He never takes the money. If they're worth that much to sell, they're worth as much to keep. Their flock of hens is an economic success. It pays. Our cows and hens and pigs are always better than folks like us have any business with," Estelle's mother says, emphasizing their business sense. Oops. Farmers around twice as well off as we haven't as good. John's even possessed to keep accounts to see where the money goes. The owners of valuable pedigreed poultry, Esther and John are the unlikely protagonists of capitalist agriculture. The poem's references to profits and business clearly indicate that this farm is linked to significant commerce, even agribusiness, despite its faded exterior. At such moments, Frost's anti-pastoral depicts rural spaces at the nexus of old and new modes of farming and the rural economy. Uneven development is a term that scholars use to describe these economic changes. The old fields with the Ford plant off in the distance, as the scholar Frederick Jameson describes. This uneven development can be seen in the overlap of modern factories like the Derry Shoe Factory, seen here, one of the largest wooden factory in the world at a certain moment, with older, more primitive structures right alongside it. It can be seen in the antique farmhouses that lacked heat and electrical, but were then remade as wilderness hostels, like this poultry farm owned by Frost's friend, George Perkins, which hosted tourists, or the type of farm tourism advertised in this postcard for Warner, New Hampshire. In New Hampshire in these years, we see ample evidence of uneven development, the jagged changes that it registers. And as we've seen, that jagged development and instability runs through many of Frost's most famous poems. To return to The Housekeeper, the poem's expensive and rare poultry inhabit a contradictory realm of value, in which rural America's cast-off citizens possess unexpected symbolic and economic capital. To some degree, this corresponds to market value. Estelle and John own an expensive rooster for which they paid $50, a substantial sum in these decades. Though relatively rare, today, the Langshan cock is an Asiatic breed known for its unusual height and plumage and was developed in the 1870s for the show pen. Frost knew the bird from poultry shows in Amesbury, Mass, Derry, and elsewhere, where he participated in exhibition agriculture. In the poem, John is invested in one of agriculture's most celebrated and expensive birds. The bird's provenance highlights the remote farm's place in a worldwide transatlantic network in which prestigious breeders accrue distinction, reputation, and capital. The Langshan hen was displayed at London's Crystal Palace, where poultry was exhibited alongside cutting-edge machinery and other rural modern inventions. Typically, the Crystal Palace featured 4 poultry shows per season. At London's Crystal Palace and its New York City counterpart, viewers could see displays of McCormick's Reaper and other icons of the rural modern, the latest tractors, threshers, plants, and livestock. This is the Agricultural Hall at the 1876 Centennial Hall in Philadelphia, which the poet Walt Whitman attended and wrote about. Whitman wrote a poem called The Song of the Exhibition, which celebrates agricultural modernity. So for Frost, himself a veteran of exhibition agriculture, the imported expensive roosters in the poem The Housekeeper are notable for their cost and breeding, but also for the skill and craft required for their maintenance. To return to mending wall for a moment, the old stone savage in the poem gains our attention both as the embodiment of the rural backwardness hypothesis, savage or brute, but also the refutation of that hypothesis. Like Estelle and John and their prized rooster, mending wall's farmer performs an act of considerable skill, dry stone masonry. From the ancient structures of Egypt to the stone walls of New England to the hills of Arcadia and Greece, dry stone wall construction depends on expert placement of stones in highly complex interlocking patterns. These walls rely on friction, gravity, but above all, the maker's expertise and skill. In this way, the walls in Mending Wall, the roosters of the housekeeper, and the ornate haystacks in The Death of the Hired Man all furnish evidence of distinctive rural artistry and expertise. Across north of Boston, rural individuals seen by many as lacking intellect, force, and modernity are instead presented as commanding a body of valuable knowledge that north of Boston seeks to consecrate and elevate. The importance that Frost accords to these rural arts is more than just sentimental or nostalgic. They're seen as presenting genuine cultural and economic worth in a leading-edge economy. They are, we might say, off-modern in the style of, say, the arts and crafts movement, which melded intense attention to traditional craftsmanship with a sleek modern look. In the poems I've been discussing today, Frost, like others of his generation, responded to a far-reaching scientific literature that described rural America in terms of backwardness and inferiority. Frost pushes back hard on the idea that rural individuals are inferior, linking them instead to a modern aesthetic and valued forms of knowledge. In recent years, I think we've become alert as never before, both to the rural and urban divide and to the presumption that rural populations are different from or lesser than urban ones in contemporary books like The Rural Brain Drain, published several years ago. In this lecture and in the book I've just completed, I'm seeking to offer a literary and cultural history of these beliefs and an argument for their significance. If we better understand the complexity of the category of the rural, its association with disease, corruption, and degradation, as well as its more familiar associations with community and belonging, we'll better understand the rich array of problems that confront agricultural and rural sectors in the US today. And in pursuing this augmented understanding of rurality, we should echo Frost and his contemporaries by deliberately considering the denigration as well as the idealization of the countryside. Finally, I want to urge us to echo the environmental scholar Nicole Seymour. She's written a book called Bad Environmentalism, which I really like. Seymour's noted that we tend to use the binary of hope versus despair when we think of threats to rural nature and rural places. I think instead we should heed Frost's example. We should embrace the highly varied affective and emotional categories like sarcasm, irony, detachment, withdrawal, comedy, when we consider the social and environmental problems that rural places and people face. The lesson we should take away from rural backwardness discourse and its history is that we should aim to detach ourselves from the tendency to either pathologize rurality or sentimentalize it. Finally, many of the divisions between rural and urban that have come into the foreground in the US today are partly the legacies of rural backwardness discourse. We should all do our part in trying to move beyond the simplistic rural-urban binaries that ideas of rural inferiority have bequeathed to us as Americans. It may be one of the most vital things we can do for America's future. A very brief coda about the Frost family. In reality, Frost's life in these years embodied the rural poverty and failure we've been hearing about in my lecture. Life on the dairy farm had the Frost family literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. One friend remembered the Frost larder in one bad period contained only oatmeal. A full meal for the family was gained by the addition of milk from the cow and salt used for the stock, scraped from the bottom of the barrel in the barn. Frost would later remember he was, quote, in the margins of farm life. Quote, I was a poor farmer in those days, he said, a point echoed by his biographer, Jeffrey Myers. Quote, agriculturally speaking, Myers says, Frost was a loser. For many of Frost's contemporaries, agriculture and loser, rurality and loser, had assumed an almost biological equivalent, just as farmer and brute had come to seem synonymous. The miracle was that amid such intense personal failure and challenge, Frost was able to remain simultaneously a realist and an optimist concerning rurality's future and its challenges. Thank you.
So I think I'll start with those, and then folks in the room can think about what they want to ask. So Marcia sort of stacked some questions in here for us. So I have a couple of questions, she says. How does anti-pastoralism, as seen through the many What's the Matter With articles during including the 1909 What's the Matter With New Hampshire, connect with the growing conservation movement of the time? Did Frost reference that at all in his poems of rural life?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where those, I have seen those at some point in my research, but I can't remember where they appeared. I think it's likely that, I think that Frost was highly familiar with a lot of this material. And by extension, he definitely could have been familiar with those articles. He was, he published, he received, I think the magazine was called New England Magazine. Eventually he published there. Like a lot of the magazines that would have been typically received in Derry or in a town like Plymouth contain a lot of this rural backwardness discourse. So it's not really that, it wasn't an urban discourse that never appeared in rural places. It was being replicated in rural publications as well, even though, I don't know if that answers the question specifically.
Yeah, and so then she has a follow-up or a kind of parallel question maybe, which is how did you get interested in Frost's time here in Plymouth?
Initially, I was working on the fact that Frost was a professor. He was appointed a professor. Well, I was interested in Frost's book, A Boy's Will, which was influenced by the history of psychology. That was a book before North of Boston. And the poems in that book never became very famous. But Frost had been trained. Well, he had spent less than a term at Harvard studying psychology, and the term will was borrowed from William James's psychology, and so then he's later appointed professor of psychology. I don't want to sound mean, but he had like no credentials whatsoever to have that position. So I sort of became. A lot of my research focuses on something weird. I read about something and I say, well, that's very weird. Why did that happen? It must be important. And I think the reality is probably that Ernest Silver, who had been the head of Pinkerton Academy in Derry and became president here at Plymouth for 35 years, he just hired Frost, even though Frost wasn't really qualified. And I don't really know why Frost decided to leave, but it seems entirely possible that Frost, at some level, he's like, oh, I'm really not a psychology professor. I studied psychology for 3 months, but I don't know whether that's true. So I sort of got interested in the kind of strangeness of that appointment and wondered how it happened.
Yeah, thanks. Questions here in the room? Yeah.
Hi, I'm James, and one of the discussion points I think that was most you talked about was Frost's depiction of rural life and stuff like that, and the stereotyping of the time of individuals who live rural and farm lives as either stupid or backwards or something. Do you think Robert Frost's works kind of breaking down that barrier had any influence on John Steinbeck when he wrote novels like Of Mice and Men? Because I initially, when you brought up those points, I thought of something like Of Mice and Men, which shows a more nuanced picture of rural agriculture. And when especially you were talking about like the Robert Frost poem with Hands for Hire, the death of the hired man, I thought instantly of like George from Of Mice and Men.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I haven't thought about Steinbeck specifically. There is a wonderful new book about Steinbeck who had really been neglected, I think, in a way, because in the past 50 years, the rural as a category has been somewhat neglected. By Gavin Jones, a professor at Stanford, has a new book about Steinbeck. And I do think a lot of other writers and artists for that matter, including, painters and photographers, are deeply influenced by these ideas. Many of you are probably familiar with that very famous painting, American Gothic, which was initially seen as an insult to the people of Iowa. And then Grant Wood, the painter, kind of emphatically said, oh, no, I've, made this picture because I revere the people of Iowa. And it was never really very clear which side of that debate he was on. But I think a lot of artists, including in the fine arts, painting, photography, and writers like Steinbeck, they were highly familiar with these debates because they were all over the mainstream newspapers and more local magazines. It was a very literate culture where many households received a lot of magazines, kind of like the internet today. And undoubtedly, I think Steinbeck would have absolutely known about these ideas and was responding to them. And specifically, I think in Mice and Men, the kind of the depiction of neurodiversity, as we would call it today, or alternative learning styles, would have been associated with rural people in the eugenics mode. And I do think Steinbeck's trying to do something a little bit different with it, and could be seen as pushing back on these ideas in a way that's similar to Frost. So thanks for that question.
Yeah,
That's
so I think there's lots of other questions. So
Okay, I was just gonna ask,
okay.
since you just brought up the point, do you think Lenny then is a depiction of how America saw rural people then, of like?
Well, okay, I'll be honest, I haven't read it since 8th grade. But I have read quite a bit of Steinbeck since the 8th grade, so I'm not totally hopeless. But, I think that a character like that, and in Frost's poems in North of Boston also have a lot of people who have let's call them like atypical cognitive organization. I'm really bending over backwards to sound neutral. And the very pejorative term for this in the eugenics discourse is feeble-mindedness, like really nasty, really stigmatizing. And I think a lot of artist types in these years become interested in a more expansive and less stigmatizing way. Undoubtedly, for our standards, they probably don't go far enough. They probably ultimately re-stigmatize at the end of the day. They're not the beneficiaries of disability studies as we are today. But nonetheless, I think Steinbeck would have thought of himself as complicating those ideas.
All right, I'll be quiet.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Abby, and then
Thank you for this fantastic talk. I have a couple things, and you can just respond to like whatever interests you. Many of you in this room have read J. Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer. So I was thinking about that particularly at the beginning of your talk, because you had this moment where you said rurality tends to be the foundation, right, of American mythology and the heartland, but you're showing that there's this tension between this sort of lamenting the decline of rural population. What do we do? And then there's this eugenic impulse, right? How do we improve, right, through scientific innovation, but also through eugenics? How do we improve that rural idea? So I'm wondering about that tension, because even in Crèvecoeur, we see there's like this Gothic underbelly to the idealization of rurality, like that tension always lives there. And of course, we see Frost really complicating this dynamic and showing that there's something in between that binary. But I guess my question, and this is also something for other people in the room to think about, particularly my American Lit students, is like, what's driving the early 20th century impulse to recover and improve and breed and control the rural idea? What's behind that? What's driving that? What's motivating that? And then my second thing is, because I can't help myself, the stuff with the poultry breeding, because the hen, I was thinking about your phrase, like the wild and hungry hen that needed to be tamed, right? And need to be sort of managed through mechanization. Do you see any parallels between the poultry breeding and the machine age and the mechanization of poultry and the eugenics movement of the time? Like poultry breeding and then like breeding particular American bodies is so resonant in today's moment. So either of those things, anything you want to speak on either of those points?
I think, okay, you could think of, what's driving rural improvement. Like some of it some of it's practical and real. Like the rural economy really was struggling. And I know that this institution's interested in environmental sustainability and kind of ecological balance. The land really had been stripped bare. Americans had, I don't want to sound grouchy, but Americans had practiced really, the Americans who were celebrated by Crèvecoeur were laying waste to the land. They were not putting any fertilizer back in the land. They were not following European practices of rotating crops. They just sort of like arrived and they started stripping the land of nutrients. And by as early as the 1780s, George Washington wrote these letters to this agriculturalist, William Strickland, in which Washington says the entire eastern seaboard has been laid bare and is infertile. At a certain moment in my project, which started with looking at this kind of degraded populations in the early 1900s, and I said, wow, like going back to 1750, people are obsessed with what they call degraded land, with the fact that the soil is barren, that farmers haven't attended to it. So actually, in fact, in the larger project, I start with Dickinson, Whitman, and Thoreau, because these writers are heavily influenced by agricultural chemistry and by the attempt to remedy the degraded land. And then the later generation gets interested in like how populations have gone downhill. But you could say that the project of thinking of rural America as something in need of reform starts with the land, and it starts more than 100 years earlier. And it really has like a genuine ecological underpinning, which is that they really have wrecked the land. I mean, I think you could also say they want to improve the rural economy because people have moved to the city, because there are hundreds of abandoned farms. And that's some of what's driving it. In terms of the link between poultry breeding and the kind of breeding that, say, the Vermont Eugenics Project would have talked about, or there's similar eugenics initiatives in Massachusetts, where I'm from. Yeah, I think there's kind of you could say there's a broad underpinning insofar as a lot of these new scientific disciplines are bringing new attention to breeding, and there's sort of a loose underpinning, or a kind of fascination with science-based technical expertise as the shiny new thing of the moment, about which Frost has this terrible anxiety. And he's having these nightmares that he's not going to be able to make it as a scientific farmer in a new scientific era. But beyond that, I don't know if I have. I mean, the obvious answer also would be that the main locus institutionally for the eugenics studies was the Cold Spring Harbor, which was the main site for all of the other kinds of breeding, mainly plants and animals that you're describing. And anyone who's interested in that, the Cold Spring Harbor has a huge archive, including all the archival photographs of the eugenics studies. But also, if any of you is a biology major or whatever, it's a huge site for the history of biology. And so it's not merely a eugenics site.
Yeah, so I think there was a question in the back. I can't really see in the blue sweatshirt. Did you have your hand up earlier? No, okay. So then we'll go here, and then Becky.
So my question, I guess, was, do you think that this idea that the lack of knowledge from the rural farmer came somewhat from the fact that scientific studies weren't as available to rural Americans, and you had things like the New England vampire scare during the tuberculosis outbreak, which would impact, because the people in the city, they know what's going on with tuberculosis, so to them, it's just a whole bunch of crazy people who are scared of vampires, and so it just shows that the rural people are idiots.
Okay, I'll admit, I wish I was familiar with the vampire scare, but I'm not. But I will be as soon as I leave this podium. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. But I mean, part of what I find, yes, obviously at some level, I agree with you. But a lot of how people got knowledge at this time was through, I mentioned briefly, through periodicals. And for example, I mean, you could say that you had to be rich to get these periodicals, certainly, in a sense. It wasn't like the internet. So let's say Emily Dickinson's family received more than 100 newspapers and different magazines in the Dickinson house. And they also had the Amherst College Library down the road, which received every conceivable publication. So to the degree that that was true, there wasn't as much of a difference between rural and urban information, you could say. But at the same time, many very remote houses just simply didn't have the money to receive I mean, it's basically information was much more keyed to economics. We hear that it is today, but most people with even a basic income can receive a huge amount of information. Whereas, I don't know if that quite answers your question, which I appreciate. But I think that theoretically, urban and rural places could have the same information. Let's say if you happen to be near a good rural library, which, for example, around New England, the Carnegie Corporation had donated lots of these wonderful libraries. So somebody who had the time to go to the library could have had the same information as an urban person. But of course, things are more complicated than that in real life. And a lot of that rural backwardness discourse focuses on how hard people prior to mechanization, just how hard people had to work on farms, and how much time it would take to get from point A to point B, even just to go to, say, the local general store, would have been a pretty big time commitment. So I think like time and money created a different version of an information gap than we have today. Thanks for that comment about the vampires.
Becky?
I teach history here, and I was an antebellum specialist the years before the Civil War. And in that period, cities are kind of the boogeyman, right? Like cities are degraded, cities are repulsive, and the rural land, the rural places are where virtue stays. And we see that in Thomas Jefferson, we see that in Krefker and other writers. So the answer may be completely obvious that what changed was the pivot was based on the rise of expertise. So it's, in other words, it sounds like it's, in a way, it's not rural versus urban, it's like rural versus expert. Does that sound right to you, or are there more things going on? And so what's the role of expertise in that split, essentially, from the period before the Civil War to these later decades?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's interesting, the difference between literary studies and historical studies, in many ways, they're the same thing, and cultural history, at least, is similar. But it's funny that in literary studies, we don't get too interested about the causation, like what actually caused it. What I would say, I mean, without sort of wimbling on the answer, is that both discourses remain. The old discourse of like the city is a den of iniquity and all of that, that doesn't go away in this period where the rural becomes newly stigmatized, and this kind of massive apparatus of thinking about the rural as inferior and backward, buttressed by science of several different kinds, things like rural sociology. A lot of the human sciences essentially start to produce a huge apparatus of discourse about rural inferiority, especially some of the new human sciences that emerge in these years. But then, but they're also producing similar discourses about cities. I think it's more just that what I was taught as an American Studies major in undergrad, which blended literature and history, was that rural America was America's heartland, that America was a nation of farmers, that rural America embodied what we were. So I was just completely shocked to come across this other discourse and to see its kind of range and its institutional manifestations. Things like Vermont eugenics and other similar eugenics are kind of the most shocking manifestation, but it's in the charters of a lot of these land grant colleges. It permeates a lot of education discourse at the time. And there's a sense that like everything in rural places is somehow lesser than, rural entertainments are spoken of with scorn and so forth. And so I do think that there's something distinctive that emerges at that moment. And that in a sense, rural communities are still bear them, I mean, it's a sort of a throwaway line, but still bear the marks of these views today. And I think many, I mean, I grew up in New England, but I live in New York City now. And I think many urban people just see the idea of rural inferiority as a fact. I think it's with us today, and it's all around us. And, you know, it really, we're still in the clutches of this kind of expertise-based paradigm that emerges at this time, but has become detached from the expert knowledge and just kind of floats around more in popular culture.
Yeah, I was really struck by the political resonance of not only rural, like sort of anguish around rural people in the political sphere, but also anguish around experts in the political sphere. Like it still tracks.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and also, I think I alluded to this at one moment, that in a lot of the rural newspapers, there emerges this massive satire of so-called book farming. And that exists, you know, the scorn of rural people turned against the expert. And the scorn of the book farmer exists all the way back to even the 1840s and 50s. The minute you start to have experts, people like the agricultural chemists that are printed in all of the publications of the 1840s and 50s and are really kind of landmark for understanding soil chemistry, how fertility works. The minute you start to have that advice being circulated, you immediately begin to have satires of, you know, the ridiculousness of people who only know how to farm from books. And that predates the period. I mean, that in a sense that gets at the, you know, a kind of obscure aspect of your question.
Thanks. Yeah.
Do you think that the higher education mindset that they were like that book farming mindset they were talking about, do you think that one of the reasons why that was constantly shared and like put out was to further disconnect those living in poverty in this rural areas to urban areas to maintain that disconnect?
So we should I just want to make sure that people on Zoom heard your question. So do you want to restate it or do you want me to? Or why don't you? Okay, so the question is about whether the kind of disdain of the book farmers is a kind of further separation of the rural and the urban. Yeah.
I mean, I think it, what I like about the satire of the book farmers is that it indicates from the beginning that rural communities have agency and an ability to speak back to power, especially, you know, the power of those who have the money to be starting these schools, which are obviously good. I don't want to appear to be critiquing land grant colleges, which clearly I'm not. In fact, I'm like mainly, I mean, I know Plymouth, I guess, isn't strictly speaking a land grant college, but or maybe it is.
No, we are
It's not- yeah.
school.
Right, exactly. Although they did teach gardening and agriculture at Plymouth as well in their old archival photographs showing like classes in gardening and classes in agriculture here as well. So the same set of impulses that led to agricultural education. So obviously all of that was kind of beneficial to rural areas. It brought new knowledge. It brought better balance to the soil. All of that is good. And bringing money and education is good. The problem is some of the kind of framing devices, let's say the charters for some of these schools or the calls to have young people enroll in the schools going back were often freighted down with this very stigmatizing language. But I do think that some of the kind of humorous satires of book farming show us that from the very beginning, rural communities and individuals were able to speak up for themselves in a sense. And in interesting and innovative ways, and that they were also part of literate culture. And that thank goodness the US always had universal primary schools and education and had, you know, it's not universal, and had a long tradition of library culture, which was not seen in Europe at that time. And so even in the most remote rural areas, no matter how benighted these areas were said to be by some of the commentators and experts, you actually had educated, literate people who were reading and who could mobilize the and also rural America was America. You know, I don't have the perfect recall on this, but around 1910 is the flip where you start to have more people living in cities. But 80% of the economy in 1900 was a rural economy. So the rural America really was still pretty dominant. And there's a certain confidence, people are speaking back. But the major newspapers, places like the Atlantic Monthly, are still running these articles that contain the kind of language that I presented today.